And you should see that here shortly. Every presenter will have 30 minutes for the totality of their presentation. That includes their presentation and a little time left for questions and answers at the end. During the Q&A session, we ask that the presenter read the question in the chat window, and that way the audio can pick that up. The chat information is not recorded. That should be pretty much it. My dog will voice in some expletives here. Yes, I know. We have first up is Jason Snyder, who will be giving us a presentation on mobile visualization of underground electric infrastructure with augmented reality and GIS. So Jason, whenever you're ready.
Sure thing. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks for either attending or watching the recording of this presentation. Today, I'll be presenting a proposal on the mobile visualization of underground electric infrastructure with augmented reality and GIS. I would like to thank my advisor, Kyle Vogt, for his assistance and guidance throughout the proposal process. My name is Jason Snyder, and I'm a senior IT geospatial analyst with Austin Energy in Austin, Texas. Austin Energy is a municipally owned electric utility serving the ever-growing greater Austin area. Today, I'll be going over an analysis of the current underground electric utility model in a geographic information system and the steps in locating underground infrastructure. The goal of this research will be to determine if a GIS mobility system integrated with augmented reality can increase safety, location awareness, and data quality assurance. My interest in the area of underground electrical locating comes from a brief time of assisting the Austin Energy one-call team early in my career. So what does a one-call team do for a utility? One call is part of the call before you dig service, and in the United States, that number to call is 811. From planting a tree to putting in a new foundation for an office tower, a call should be placed to 811, or you can now use the 811 Center's website to place a request. This begins the process of locating any potential underground utilities in the area of work. Once a request is made, a ticket is created in the call center's database and sent to all utilities servicing the work request area. The members of the one-call team will review the ticket, and typically with the use of a utility GIS system, will determine whether to send a locator to the work site or clear the request if no underground infrastructure is present. If a locate is necessary, the locator will utilize electromagnetic and ground penetrating radar equipment to assess the location of underground utilities in the area. A signal is applied to the target utility using a transmitter, and the technician will wand or sweep over the area until receiving a signal transmission. Then paint or a flag is placed on the ground in the area the signal was received. I'm sure you've seen these markings before. Each color represents a specific utility, and each utility has a specific buffer to determine where not to dig. Underground utility damage is not only costly, but is a safety hazard to everyone working on an excavation project. In the US, an underground strike from excavation occurs every 60 seconds. Recent estimates by the Common Ground Alliance's DIRT report from 2019 placed the cost of utility damage from excavation at roughly $30 billion in the United States alone. So what are the main causes for damages? The top reason for damage stems from not making a call or request for location assistance. The other main causes occur due to inaccurate markings and maintaining visuals of the markings placed by the locators. This includes the paint washing away or flags moved or removed. This will be a focus of the project, how to potentially use GIS and augmented reality to maintain visuals of underground infrastructure, location, and routing. Geographic information systems have modernized the way a utility manages assets and collects field data over the past few decades. In the book, GIS for Enhanced Electric Utility Performance, the author Meehan states the main purpose of modeling the utility distribution GIS is to improve the awareness of location, condition, and relationship of the entire distribution system, including structural elements. By replacing paper maps and design prints, a GIS can provide people in the field, as well as back office employees, with up-to-date information on the distribution system through the use of interactive mobile applications. Updates on assets and infrastructure can be made firsthand using field mobility technology and can send information back to end users, such as the control center, in real time. With advancements in modeling a utility network through GIS, underground locating has become slightly more efficient in determining the location of assets with mobile mapping systems. A well-maintained GIS system allows the utility to quickly identify routing of infrastructure and places of access. This is not only beneficial to locators of a one-call team, but distribution crews needing to make repairs, distribution designers determining connection possibilities for new development, and the control center directing crews and troubleshooters to areas that need to be investigated. In this sample display of an underground circuit loop, the poles are represented by the white circles with brown outline. The overhead line attached to the poles is represented by the dark blue lines offset from the poles. The S symbol on the pole represents a riser fuse that serves as both a protective and isolating device to the underground cabling. At this point, the flow of power transitions from above ground to underground. The only visible assets from the ground of the underground network are the pad mount transformers, pole boxes or manholes, and the meter itself. The light blue lines represent the routing of the underground primary cable that is providing power to the transformers. The dashed pink lines represent the secondary power that is provided from the transformers to the customer, which in this model is represented by the light bulb. The orange lightning bolts represent fault indicators that are placed on the cable inside of a transformer to indicate if there is a fault along a span of cable. Because this is a loop design, there are two riser fuses providing power to the entire underground circuit with an open point represented by the green circle that stops the convergence of power at that point within the transformer. Having two directions of power allows a crew to isolate a cable span if it needs to be fixed or replace a bad transformer, all while minimizing the loss of power to other customers along the circuit. So, as you can see in this image provided by Google for the base map, this once open field now has several hundred feet of underground electric cable to provide electric service to a multi-unit project. And thanks to Nearmap for the most current base map imagery. From the bird's eye view that the GIS provides for this model, it is easy to see the routing of cable and general direction of power flow. But from ground level, it can become confusing and difficult for the user to follow along the path of underground infrastructure. The technician or locator used to be at the mercy of either a paper map or one-line drawing. But with a mobile GIS system that can guide the user to specific points of access to the underground network, the field user can determine correct location by verifying asset ID numbers on transformers, switching devices, and poles against the GIS database. To an untrained eye, it's difficult to perceive the amount of underground distribution that it takes for a seemingly small area to be energized. There are a few indicators that locators and electric distribution crews can spot to determine potential routing of underground cable to service different assets. The most obvious is the pad mount transformer, painted green to semi-blend in with the surroundings. The manhole in the street is holding multiple primary cables to provide energy to various transformers in the area, including this one. The next is the location of a service pole box that contains wires being fed from the transformer that will eventually provide power for a temporary construction meter for development in that graded space. There is also a street light and many others further down the road that are being energized from this transformer. And finally, a communication box for phone, cable, and fiber optic wiring that is being supplied power via underground wiring. As you can see, the direction and pathways to supply energy downstream is rarely a linear process and involves many shapes and turns. This creates the opportunity for locators to potentially mark an incorrect route or miss one entirely. Augmented reality, or AR, provides a format to bring elements contained within a virtual environment into view within the physical environment. not to be confused with virtual reality or VR, which provides a virtual environment through the use of technology. Augmented reality uses the camera on a mobile device and GPS to provide a layer of information, text, or images that is overlapped onto the existing environment captured in the view frame. Within the mixed reality spectrum, augmented reality aligns closest with physical reality. This is along the reality-virtuality continuum. Augmented reality really became a mainstream phenomenon in 2016 with the release of Nintendo's mobile game Pokemon Go. The game would utilize a user's mobile device's GPS to find virtual creatures in real-world locations. Augmented reality can similarly take the data stored within a utility GIS model and provide integrated virtual constructs of the data model to be viewed and analyzed on the screen of a mobile device based on the user's location. This is not to say that augmented reality could or should take the place of actual underground locating with a high level of location accuracy. This research is done with the idea of how it can assist in locating and further support in analyzing the current landscape of underground routing and design. Paint markings from a previous locate eventually wash away, flags are removed, underground infrastructure routing is changed for redevelopment. Each time a new excavation project is proposed, an underground locate needs to occur to largely negate any potential utility damage. However, the use of augmented reality could potentially save the locator time by assisting in locating the underground routing. So the objective of this proposal is to develop and present a design for a prototype mobile mapping application that incorporates the use of augmented reality to virtually display underground electrical lines and assets in a real-world scenario. From the prototype application, an analysis will be done through field testing to determine if a mobile GIS integrated with augmented reality can provide an advantage to the current locating process. The proposed methodology for this research consists of 4 parts: a survey for potential mobile application and augmented reality design and functionality, a wireframe prototype application, development of electrical GIS into augmented reality, and a field test of the augmented reality test application. The first approach will be an open-ended survey of electrical professionals to gather input for design and functionality of a prototype application. In his book, Thinking About GIS, Tomlinson states that prior research on design and development has determined that an approach planned around the user's needs will typically lead to a successful integration and deployment of an application. The goal is to have 2 participants from 5 different groups involved from electric service delivery. These will include one-call locators, control center operators, GIS services, distribution electricians, and electrical service designers. The survey will cover aspects of interface layout, usability standards, and scenarios where integrated augmented reality could improve the virtual visibility and efficiency of underground locating in the field. The questionnaire will also capture how each user uses the mobile GIS software. The current mobility package at Austin Energy is a GE design interface called Electric Office Web, or EO Web as it is commonly referred to. The discussion will cover the advantages and disadvantages of the mobile application and what changes could be made in order to better suit their needs. A wireframe prototype application interface will be designed with the integrations recommended by the survey results. The results should guide the design and its focus on implementing augmented reality into a field mobile mapping application and determine the optimal operability for field analysis. Using a wireframe application such as Balsamiq, a schematic or blueprint example of an application interface can be created and edited fairly quickly with the ability to make relatively seamless adjustments once feedback is received. This is a low fidelity design that will encourage discussion on the look and feel of a potential application. Here's an example of a wireframe mockup designed for a sample mobility application using Balsamiq. The third step will be to create a test augmented reality application for testing in the field. This will potentially be accomplished through the use of an open source tool called AR Toolkit for AR integration, and the Unity application for 3D design of the sample electrical data set. AR Toolkit currently supports Microsoft Windows, Mac OS X, Linux, iOS, and Android platforms. The focus of the prototype application for this project will be on development within the iOS platform. Since iOS is the chosen platform for this research project, there is the potential to use ARKit framework provided by Apple should there be any issues with the open source AR Toolkit. Another potential application for visualization of underground infrastructure would be the ArcGIS City Engine to produce sample pipeline and cable routing for testing purposes. This will be a standalone application built solely for testing the use of AR for underground location and analysis. Field testing will be performed on an iPhone or iPad provided by the project lead. The goal is to have upwards of 6 participants to use and provide feedback of the test application. I've already secured testers from the OneCall and GIS field team members. The OneCall team is made up of underground locators with experience in marking and flagging routing of underground cable. The GIS field team is comprised of distribution electricians who perform daily inspections of the electrical grid to verify and validate changes and updates to the GIS system. Future considerations on data flow, field edits, and system architecture for field and office mobility communication will be included in the final report. All underground electrical GIS test scenarios will involve test data obtained from the Austin Energy database and used in a proof of concept setting. Utilizing GE's Small World Electric Office application to design the experimental underground routing and asset locations within an open public space, the sample data will be exported into a shapefile format for configuration in the Unity application. Sample data will include points of above ground entry or visual landmarks that will portray the asset in the field. So for example, a hazard cone can represent a manhole. Scenarios will be based on real world situations where underground electrical utility infrastructure locating can potentially benefit from the use of an AR field mobility application. These scenarios will include underground primary and secondary distribution systems, conduit and/or cable, residential and commercial services, and streetlight. A data analysis of the current mobility software available to Austin Energy locators and field distribution crews will be done, with feedback collected from users to consider the state of limitations in electrical asset locating and awareness of cable routing. The data collected from the survey of electrical professionals will be utilized extensively in the prototype design phase, applied in the configuration of the application interface and data visualization concepts. Feedback from field testing of the prototype application will be incorporated in the final project narrative and any potential improvements included in a future work section. The field testing on the use of augmented reality in the GIS mobile application should provide insight into any advantages or disadvantages with location awareness. The conclusion of the project should include the successful development of a prototype AR mobile application for underground electrical inspection. During the process of the project, a thorough understanding of AR capabilities within a GIS-based mobility application should be gained. A comprehensive analysis on the complexities of integrating augmented reality into a GIS field application should be achieved. Results of the final survey and testing of applications should provide constructive feedback for any improvements or challenges with utilizing AR in the field of underground electrical locating. The timeline for the project begins this month as research on the tools and software programs for developing and integrating augmented reality has just begun. I will be relying heavily on skills learned while obtaining a geospatial programming and web map development certificate, including my time working with the Unity program over the past year. Designing the augmented reality interface has the potential to be the most challenging aspect of this project, and getting an early start will be key in accomplishing the objective. The survey will be developed and reviewed in late May, while I have reserved June through September to work on sample dataset creation, the exporting of data into necessary formats for AR creation, and conducting the survey among the peers of my profession. Once survey results are collected, I can focus time on designing the wireframe prototype in early October, including the feedback and enhancements recommended through the questionnaire. From late October to early November, the plan is to have the mobile augmented reality application functional and displaying underground pipelines in the test environment. Assuming that the application is good to test, I will schedule field testing with participants and gather their feedback on the use and functionality of augmented reality as a means to assist in underground electric infrastructure locating. All data gathered, results obtained, and steps in the development process will be recorded and included in the final report and presentation in December 2022. Currently, there's very limited availability of conferences scheduled late in the year. However, Distribute Tech is a conference I have attended before, and I believe it would be a great fit for presenting the final project. The conference will be held in San Diego, California through the 7th and 9th of February 2023. Another option that we're all familiar with would be an online presentation, possibility later this year. And here is a list of references used for the proposal presentation. And that completes the presentation portion of my project proposal on the mobile visualization of underground electric infrastructure with augmented reality in GIS. Are there any questions?
All right, Jason, great presentation.
Thank you.
If you can open up the chat, there's a question for you right now. And then please make sure to read the question before answering it.
Sure. This is from Jonathan. Great presentation and really interesting topic. With regards to the field test, do you envision any task-based activities where there is a known correct answer? If so, I'm also curious if you plan to compare time to complete tasks between current tools and the AR prototype. And that's a great question, Jonathan. There will be some task-based activities. This is really more or less for visualization purposes. How do they envision this working with a mobility system? If we can get it to where it looks, like they can actually see the routing of pipeline underground or where it may be located with the use of AR, I think then we can move forward from there. Task-based will basically be, okay, we have this point, which can represent a manhole, and then we have another point that represents a transformer. Is there a way, or do you see AR helping to visualize the pipeline running from point A to point B? And then with the current tools, the current mobility package that they use, which is a pretty lightweight field mobility interface, just it takes the GIS data so you can see it, as a 2D map. And then obviously, how can AR, create a better advantage, towards locating the underground utilities in the area? Great questions.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. Let's see. This one's from Anthony. Nice work, Jason. What do you think you will try to measure to gauge success from your evaluation? One thought would be to do pre-post task survey questions that ask folks if they consider using AR to solve certain utility problems. See if the experience they have with what you create changes some minds. And those are great suggestions. So measuring to gauge success from your evaluation, that's a good one. I have to sit out and really evaluate that. Basically, I'm trying to get ideas from the electrical professionals as to how limited they are currently, and what what tools could be provided within an application that can help them out in their everyday locating of devices in the field. This one's from Marcella. Very interesting project. I probably missed this, but can you talk a bit more about the potential users of this app? Are they the same people that you listed will be completing the survey? Yes, so the actual users of the app or participants in the testing will be OneCall field personnel and GIS field personnel, which are distribution electricians. Now, if there is more time, I would love to have office folk, whether it be GIS services, back office, control center, or troubleshooters if they can get involved, great. But right now I'm just focused on those two groups as they're, I'm especially with the one call locating, this is really my focus. But if I can get more involved, great. That will give me more opinions and feedback as well. So thanks, Marcella.
I have a real quick question, Jason. You mentioned in the AR prototype the issue of coordinate accuracy. What kind of positional accuracy are you expecting for your AR tool?
It'll probably be limited. I'm not expecting a high amount of accuracy. The GIS data itself isn't completely accurate. Our transformers are, in a GIS system are 12 feet by 12 feet, but they're not that in the real world. We run our underground cabling offset a lot of times from the land base, which is not representative of actual underground cabling. So there's a little bit of difference of that. Right now, I'm just trying to get the visual aspect down and worry less about the complete accuracy of where it runs. But yes, that is a very important aspect of the use of AR for a field mobility application.
All right, thanks. Another question popped up in the chat.
Yeah, from Ryan. Excellent talk. I'm curious about how CAD fits into this project. Our utility companies are already using CAD to perform these functions. Will you need to integrate your GIS with existing CAD systems? All good questions, Ryan. Our customer service design team or electric service design team actually uses AutoCAD. There is an electric application that they use. I think it's called AUD that they currently use. So we have the ability to import that into Electric Office, but obviously we have a middleman that they try and talk in between, so it's not that great. So a lot of it is, so the design is done in AUD, the print goes out to the field, and then once the as-built is done, it comes to GIS and we update the GIS that way. And we need to integrate your GIS with existing CAD systems. Yeah, that's something that's been talked about quite a bit. It's kind of gone back and forth, what do you want, the CAD system or the GIS? GE offers their design tools, and then obviously AutoCAD offers their GIS. So it's really a business decision at that point. But great questions.
All right, Jason, if you want to put your email in the chat window, if someone has a follow-up question, they can contact you that way.
Sure.
And then if you would stop sharing your screen, and Clint, if you're ready, start sharing your screen and we can take a look at that.
All right. Hello, everyone. Get this up. Just to start. All right. Everybody see that all right?
Yeah, we see it and your audio is loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. So hello, everyone. My name is Clint Henry, and I'm presenting my capstone project proposal. It's entitled A Geospatial Analysis of Mortality in Relation to Proximity of Coal Mining in West Virginia. I currently work for an environmental engineering company in West Virginia that focuses on permitting, mitigation, and reclamation for coal and other hard rock mineral mining. Before I start, I want to thank everyone who is attending today, and also to thank my advisor, Jennifer Baca, for her ideas, support, and encouragement. So the aim of this project would be to investigate the impacts of coal extraction or mining on the public health communities surrounding impacted areas in the coal-bearing regions of Appalachia, specifically in West Virginia. It has been speculated that the communities surrounding coal extraction operations are exposed to public health risks through air and water pollution. Until the mid-2000s, studies focusing on the health impacts of surface coal mining concentrated on miners, but few considered the potential downstream and downslope effects on communities surrounding these coal mines. Instead, it was assumed that the health disparities in the region could be explained by poverty or lifestyle issues like smoking and obesity. Since then, multiple scholarly articles, have concluded that coal mining contributes significantly to higher rates of mortality due to birth defects, cancer, cardiovascular, and respiratory disease among individuals living in the coal-bearing regions of Appalachia. However, some follow-up studies have been done that refute this, suggesting instead that the culprit for health disparities found in this area is high levels of socioeconomic inequalities. There exist debates on both sides regarding the accuracy of these studies, and reviews of the literature suggest that some of the research done was exposed to bias. Few studies have been found that utilize geospatial information systems to investigate the issue, despite the geographic nature of the problem. Most of the previous research has utilized health data aggregated at the county level, as that is the most commonly available distribution of public health statistics. Privacy concerns prevent the circulation and acquisition of health statistics at a more finite scale, and countywide studies discount the fact that population density and location of mining permits can vary widely within the county level boundaries, and that mining located near county borders likely has cross-county effects. It is proposed that a non-biased analysis of mortality in communities within the vicinity of surface coal mines to that of Appalachian communities outside the radius of these operations using a geospatial analysis might expose a more definitive correlation between mortality and proximity to surface mining operations. Specifically, the study will utilize aerial interpolation and dosimetric mapping to disaggregate available countywide mortality data into finer scale area units, like census tracts or block groups, utilizing census population statistics as ancillary data to guide the interpolation process. Covariates will similarly be redistributed to the finer scale area units before regression analysis specific to spatial data is performed. This analysis will limit its geographic focus to the state of West Virginia for several reasons. West Virginia is the only state which lies entirely within the bounds of Appalachia and the Appalachian coal fields. It is well established as a coal mining state, producing more coal regionally than any other state east of the Mississippi. With regards to surface mining, West Virginia contains 3 of the 5 highest coal producing counties in the United States. Nearly all of these states surrounding West Virginia are coal producing states, with their most productive counties directly adjacent to West Virginia. Finally, geographic mine location data is readily available and accessible through the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. This presentation will include a history of coal and coal mining in Appalachia, a discussion of what surface mining is, potential sources of pollution from surface mining, a brief discussion about the natural resource curse, descriptions of health disparities in West Virginia, and then I will present my data sets, sources, and proposed methodology. To understand the problem, it's important to understand to some extent the history of Appalachia and its relationship with coal and coal mining. Therefore, the following sections have been included to give background and context to a question that is more complex than one might think. In the eastern United States, Appalachia stretches from northern Alabama and Georgia to southern New York. The central Appalachian coal fields involve nearly all of West Virginia, as well as parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Occurring within the oldest mountain range on Earth, its complex terrain is characterized by steep slopes and deep gorges. Since the last ice age, the region has been mostly forested and is currently home to one of the most biodiverse and varied ecosystems in the world. Appalachia contains some of the largest reserves of natural resources in the United States, including timber, gas, and timber, coal, and natural gas. Large-scale timber harvesting was one of the first significant industries affecting Appalachia during the 18th century. Coal mining in Appalachia started as early as the mid-1700s, but initially only supplied residential and commercial use. Starting in the 1850s and lasting for well over a century, coal from Appalachia to a great extent fueled the American Industrial Revolution and the resulting prosperity in America. Industrial development, increased use of iron and steel, glass factories, and railroad expansion were early drivers in the demand for coal. A large number of Appalachian communities were developed during this time, with coal as the primary driver of their economic survival. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, Appalachia was the principal provider of coal in the United States, but the volatility of the industries and markets depending on coal led to a boom and bust cycle for the Appalachian coal fields. It wasn't until the 1970s when the relatively stable and growing electrical markets dependence on coal producers reduced this volatility, and production of coal increased through the end of the 20th century. At about the same time, Appalachian dominance in the United States coal markets was being challenged by Western coal producers. In the 1970s, we saw a boom in the coal markets driven by an energy crisis in America due to oil supply disruptions. While production increased in Appalachia, much of the easiest to reach seams have been mined out, and the cost of traditional methods of extraction was increasing as mines expanded ever deeper into the mountains. To the west, thick seams of coal were being mined in the relatively flat expanses of Wyoming and Illinois at a cost that Appalachian coal producers had difficulty competing with. However, while these states would supplant Appalachian coal dominance in supplying energy markets before the end of the century, Appalachian coal fields would find themselves uniquely situated to capture metallurgical coal markets, both domestically and abroad, due to the abundance of anthracitic coal formations found there. Anthracite coals burn hotter and with fewer emissions than the more common bituminous coals used for energy production. Metallurgical coal markets required these unique qualities and would pay significantly more for them. For example, in 2018, U.S. average prices for metallurgical or coking coals were more than 3 times those of electrical power markets. Further stimulation of coal mining in Appalachia and West Virginia came in the form of the Clean Air Act passed in the 1990s. This law, which required a lowering of emissions, increased the demand for and use of the low sulfur coal found in Appalachian coal fields. Today, coal mining persists despite the continued fluctuation of coal markets and the declining popularity of coal due to environmental concerns. There are 2 primary methods used to conduct coal mining operations: deep mining and surface mining. Deep mining is self-explanatory and is what most people think of when they contemplate coal mining operations. This mining technique takes place hundreds to thousands of feet underground and produces a relatively small surface footprint. It's labor intensive, and pillars of coal are left behind to support the roof structure of these mines, reducing the profit margin for coal companies. This was the primary way coal was extracted during the early days of mining and continues today to produce the majority of coal being mined in Appalachia. Surface mining began in earnest after World War II as technology improved to provide more sophisticated mechanized means of excavation to include powerful and larger haul trucks and excavators. Aided by explosives, miners began initially with contour mining, by which they cut into the hillside along coal outcroppings, removing the overburden and extracting the coal beneath. Competitive production from Western coal regions during the later part of the 20th century, along with the energy crisis of the 1970s, drove mining companies in Appalachia to look for cheaper methods of extracting coal from ever-thinning coal seams. It was during this time that innovation and mechanization would spur the growth of surface mining to include mountaintop mining or mountaintop removal, allowing for the extraction of coal from seams previously inaccessible to deep mining. This method allowed miners access to multiple, although thinner, seams of coal using less manpower at reduced costs. Through this method of surface mining, mountains and ridges were excavated to depths of 100 meters or deeper to retrieve multiple seams of coal. While these seams were sometimes only 1 meter thick, pillars did not have to be left to support the mountain above, and so production was further increased. Today, surface mines span hundreds of acres across mountain ridges through West Virginia and other parts of Appalachia, and excavate as much as 300 meters of mountaintop to expose deeper seams of coal. Despite declines in demand for bituminous coal, the improvements and advancements of mechanization, along with the increased demand and price point of metallurgical coal, have continued to drive the expansion of mountaintop removal well into the 21st century. Surface mining operations, both contour and mountaintop, have significant potential to affect air and water quality. Water quality can be affected both by runoff from these mines and by the disposal of byproducts from the processing of coal. The exposure of rock and soil to oxygen and rain result in the dissolving of pyrite and release of minerals, metals, and other chemicals previously confined in the rock strata. These include selenium, aluminum, and sulfate. Increased levels of hydrogen sulfide, pH, conductivity, and total dissolved solids downstream of mining sites have been documented. The removal of forests and topsoil, the use of heavy explosives, and the heavy machinery used to excavate and haul rock and coal can create substantial amounts of particulate matter, which is a portion of air pollution containing acids, organic chemicals, metals, soil, and dust particles. Particulate matter air pollution is the 13th leading cause of mortality worldwide, contributing to 800,000 premature deaths each year. Studies link particulate matter to broad cause of death including cardiovascular and respiratory disease, and the presence of antimony, arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, lead, manganese, mercury, nickel, and selenium have been discovered in respirable concentrations of dust near surface coal mining operations. In the past, and prior to the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, also known as the Mine Act or SMCRA, overburden from surface mining was pushed over the edge of the hillside and into the valleys below, with little to no effort being made to reclaim the landscape post-mining. Mining operations which occurred prior to 1977 are referred to as pre-law mining. Today, coal mining sites are heavily regulated by state and federal organizations, including the Department of Environmental Protection, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which work to ensure that these hazards are mitigated through erosion control, drainage control, and reclamation. All waters leaving the site must satisfy water quality standards under the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act. Blasting guidelines regulate blasting operations as issued under the Department of Blasting, and dust control measures must be utilized. Mountains must be returned to their approximate original contours, covered with topsoil, and reseeded and revegetated before mines can be released for their reclamation requirements. The question of whether this is enough to protect the public from potential contamination and pollution remains. West Virginia is a textbook example of what some refer to as the natural resource curse. This term describes the observation that countries or colonies that have bountiful natural resources are cursed by poor economic performance. In her book, Bringing Down the Mountains, Shirley Burns describes West Virginia as a peripheral region within the American global market system. Peripheral regions are larger spatial areas with comparatively smaller populations, smaller cities, and smaller amounts of power in the economic and political systems. This has resulted in the dominance and prioritization of industry and resource extraction over the rights of citizens. The belief that these resources would bring wealth to the state has led to limited economic diversification and a single industry, resource-dependent economy. In truth, much of this wealth leaves the state and flows into the hands of absentee landowners, and little is left for reinvestment in roads, infrastructure, and social capital. Exacerbated by the boom and bust cycle of coal, this economic dependence upon extractive industries has not resulted in sustained economic growth and instead resulted in poor economic performance. Lack of investment in infrastructure has further hindered attracting other industries and economic diversification, resulting in West Virginia's strong dependence on coal. This single industry economy has led to a lack of job choices, and as a consequence, West Virginia is one of the 5 states with the highest poverty rates, has the 2nd lowest median household income, and the 7th highest child poverty rate among children. Poverty and income inequality are the biggest drivers of health inequities, both in the developing and the developed world. Populations in West Virginia and Appalachia as a whole are known to suffer higher morbidity and mortality in relation to the rest of the nation. Cancer incidence in the Appalachia region is higher than that of the United States overall. The issue of the cause is complicated by abnormally lower salaries, high rates of poverty, income inequities, old populations, lower percentage of high school graduates, higher rates of obesity, and increased tobacco consumption. This study intends to look at the 5 dependent variables of morbidity that have been noted to be caused by particulate matter pollution that are of abnormally high incidence in West Virginia and were cited in other related studies on health effects of coal mining on surrounding communities. These include all-cause mortality, all cancers, lung and bronchial cancers, respiratory disease, and cardiovascular disease. In terms of all-cause mortality, Kentucky and West Virginia, both Appalachian coal-producing states, are 2 of the top 5 states with the highest age-adjusted death rates. Currently, heart disease, cancer, and chronic lower respiratory disease are the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd leading causes of death, respectively, in West Virginia. West Virginia has the 4th highest rate of new cancers in the United States and the 3rd highest rate of cancer deaths, with lung and bronchus cancers being the leading cause of cancer death. New cancers and cancer deaths in Appalachia have remained high or increased while falling for the rest of the United States. While annual numbers of cancers and cancer deaths have trended downwards in the majority of states, they have remained high and have even increased in coal-producing states of Appalachia, particularly for lung and bronchial cancers in Kentucky and West Virginia. West Virginia currently ranks third highest in chronic lower respiratory disease mortality among the United States. While the southern block of states consistently lead the nation in total cardiovascular deaths, the Appalachian states of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee follow closely behind, and West Virginia leads in hospitalization for cardiovascular disease. The goals and objectives of this analysis is to determine the factors contributing to high mortality in West Virginia caused by all cancer mortality, all cancers, lung and bronchus cancers, respiratory disease, and cardiovascular disease. These dependent variables were chosen because of their abnormally high rate of occurrence in West Virginia, their causational relationship with particulate matter, and because they were cited in a number of previous and related studies. Of the contributing factors, it is hypothesized that surface mining will be a primary contributor to mortality, and that as proximity to surface mining increases, mortality caused by the aforementioned dependent variables will similarly increase. The primary questions this analysis expects to answer will be: do residents living within proximity of surface mining operations face increased risk of mortality? And if so, is this increased mortality caused by coal mining or some other factor? In terms of data and materials, our first data set necessary to address this question will be mortality data. This data is available by county as a tab delimited data through the CDC Wonder site and can be queried by year and ICD code. Our second data set required would be that representing geological location of surface mining during the time of investigation. A geodatabase file is available through the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection and includes the location of all mining permits issued from 1977 forward. This data set can be queried by permit issue date, mine status, and permit type to determine the location of active surface mining sites. Additionally, population data by census tract or block group will be required. For this study, a choice has been made to focus on the years 2005 and 2015, as this correlates with a peak in surface mining occurring between 2010 and 2011. It also brackets the 2010 census data, which provides population data aggregated at multiple aerial levels, smaller than the county level, as required for this analysis. Additional independent core variables have been sought to explain or predict the chosen mortalities. All data was aggregated at the county level. The data sets acquired or to be acquired for investigation in this analysis are as follows: no health insurance, obesity, physical inactivity, median income, no diploma, poverty, unemployment, tobacco consumption. Other census data and potential contributors to mortality will be considered in categories ranging from health to demographics and from risk factors to social and environmental factors. The ones I have listed were selected from these categories as the most likely to have a correlation to the dependent variables. In terms of analysis, one of the most important steps in this analysis and the process that is intended to advance the work of previous studies on this topic is the aerial interpolation of countywide health data to smaller aerial units. Previous studies show correlation of mountaintop removal and surface mining to negative health effects within the surrounding communities, but not causation. With refinement of the data into smaller units, it is hoped that a stronger conclusion can be drawn. Spatial interpolation is a commonly used method in geographical research that uses values of known geographic points or area units to estimate or predict values at unknown points or area units. Often applied to spatial data, it is able to estimate values at finer resolution than that of the original data. Aerial interpolation is a method of spatial interpolation using area features where the source data is insufficiently fine for the analysis needed. It is therefore interpolated from the source zones to smaller target zones. Ancillary data can be used in order to enhance the aerial interpolation in a process called diametric mapping. This approach uses related data as spatial control to guide the redistribution of data. In this analysis, aerial interpolation using diametric mapping will be used to redistribute mortality and covariate data from countywide source zones to smaller census tract or block group target zones, with population data utilized as the ancillary data to guide the process. ArcPro has a geostatistical analysis extension that supplies an aerial interpolation tool, and I've read that RStudio may have packages that can do the same. Once the aerial interpolation process is complete, an investigation of the data sets will be performed with R and RStudio. This exploratory data analysis will be done with the intention to improve comprehension of the data. Next, we'll examine relationships through scatter plots and correlational analysis. Through this process, a correlation test will be conducted using Pearson's method and a correlation matrix created. This process is intended to help us discover relationships of variables to each other and, more importantly, to the dependent variables. Our final step in RStudio will involve performing a regression analysis with our dependent and independent variables using the linear method, with the goal of determining the significance of the independent variables in predicting mortality. At this point, we will utilize ArcGIS Pro to complete our analysis to validate what was discovered in RStudio regarding our hypothesis and the significance of the surface mining on mortality. We will run ordinary least squares regression analysis with these pairs of data sets. Additionally, the exploratory regression tool in ArcPro will be used to investigate all combinations of our variables for significance to the dependent variables. And our final step in this analysis will be to run a geographically weighted regression. This local regression will be done due to the spatially varying nature of the data. My timeline for completion, or my goal for completion, is fall 2, semester of 2022. And I've looked into a few venues for presentation. One that stands out is the International Pittsburgh Coal Conference, although the early date of September is a little early for my timeline. American Coal Council Coal Trading Conference occurs in December, which is a more likely route for me to go. I have a list of references here that I've used, and another one. And thank you very much for listening and participating today. Anybody have any questions?
All right, Clint, thanks for a great presentation. As questions come up in the chat window, if anyone has questions, Clint, if you could just read them before you answer them, that'd be great.
Sure, as soon as I find that. I lost my, oh, there we go.
So while we're waiting for folks to put a question up for you, I was curious to know if you'd, this may be a little bit out of context, but whether you'd consider including oil and gas well drilling or fracking that has been taking place in West Virginia as part of your study of, in addition to the coal mining.
It's certainly a interesting area of study. West Virginia fracking typically takes place in the northern parts of West Virginia, in the Panhandle, closer to PA. I think there's a lot more fracking going on in Pennsylvania right now. So it wasn't really an area of interest for me, partially because it's not something that my company does a whole lot of. But I think it could be a separate study. I think that it causes a pollution, and what it affects is a lot different than what coal mining does, partially because of the area that it's more of a linear type thing in terms of gas lines, whereas coal mining is kind of constrained to the immediate vicinity of the coal mine itself. But I think it'd be a great direction to go for sure.
All right. If you have your chat window open, there's a question for you.
Yeah, Anthony here says, "Hi, Clint. Cool project. I'm originally from Cumberland, Maryland, so quite familiar with coal territory in Appalachia. Have you considered using a spatial scan statistic like SAT scan to identify clusters?" I hadn't. It's definitely something I should probably look into potentially. and actually not something had heard. I've heard of spatial scans, but not the particular one you mentioned there. I appreciate your link. I'll take a look. Yeah, and you're right about the time lag between exposure and the health events. Definitely read into some of that, and sometimes health events can take years and to manifest. So part of the reason that I did the 10-year window, looking at 2000 and 2005, and then again 2015, is to see if there was a difference there in terms of the time lag issue. But the fact that these coal mines have been around since 1977, I guess, so there's lots of factors there. Even the reclaimed mines, or especially the pre-law mines, can still be potential polluters at this point. So in terms of Ryan Baxter's question here, you mentioned using disometric mapping to digitize your spatial units for analysis. Can you say a bit more about what you might do? Will they essentially be census boundaries or something more unique? Yeah, I'm looking at census boundaries. I feel like census tracts are too large to get me the to get me the analysis that I need, the results. I'm looking for something that would be smaller than that. So the question becomes, do I use blocks or block groups? Blocks are certainly the smallest unit, and I'm going to have to experiment with which one of those will work better. I think blocks would work better, but again, dividing or taking countywide data and aggregating it to such a small unit, I don't know how accurate that would be. So I think that might take some experimentation. Anthony, it is very commonly used in cancer epidemiology, excuse me, and you'll find a ton of papers using similar approaches. Okay, this is a reference to the SAT scan. I definitely will check that out, and I appreciate the insight for sure.
Clint, if you would put your contact info in the chat window, so if someone has a follow-up question, they can contact you and get some more details from you, that'd be great. And before we continue, I want to make sure that our presenters in the chat window are aware of the peer review evaluation form. So those of you that are presenting, click on the link and complete the form as soon as you get a chance after tonight's presentation. Thanks again, Clint, for your presentation. And next up, we have Thomas McAvoy. Thomas, if you can get your
hi there, folks. Give me just 2 seconds there, just making sure that my screen is set correctly. Okay. Can everybody see my title screen and hear me?
Audio is loud and clear, but there is no screen shown.
Uh-oh. Okay, hold on 1 second there, folks. Share. Okay.
There we go.
There it is. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Can everybody see and hear okay?
Positive on both aspects.
Okay. Sorry? Oh, all good to begin?
Yep, take it away.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Thomas McAvoy, and I am going to be presenting my capstone project proposal, which is leveraging historical cartography to assess and monitor the geomorphologic changes of the St. Augustine Inlet from 1589 to 2022. My advisor, I'd like to go out and say, is with great pride, is Jonathan Nelson. He has been phenomenal in helping me prepare for my presentation this evening. So to begin, I work at the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum as the GIS technician for the Lighthouse Archaeological Program, or LAMP. The images that you see in the lower left, that is the view from my office inside the top of the tower, and that is where I work, looking out over at the St. Augustine Inlet in a building that is over 143 years old. The LAMP team is made up of archaeologists, conservators, and researchers whose mission is to discover, preserve, and protect historical artifacts of North Florida's Atlantic coast. The LAMP team has discovered or been involved in over 110 archaeological sites and has recovered thousands of artifacts. The historic and archaeological value of the St. Augustine Inlet is the fact that it is the first and earliest navigational entrance to the first European port in continental North America. The inlet is rich in shipwrecks. It is conservatively estimated that there are over 500 shipwrecks that could be found within a 25-mile range of the inlet, and that the majority of these wrecks are within 1 mile of the present coastline. There are several geophysical factors that are responsible for this high rate of shipwrecks. The most notable being crazy banks and hidden shoals. These are sand form in as little as 24 hours and dissipate in an equally short amount of time. Turbulent currents from the Matanzas and Tolomato river systems, and also just a historically shallow point of entry. The images below give you a sense for how many wreck sites the LAMP team has recorded. The image on the left shows where LAMP has been across all of North Florida, whereas the image on the right shows the sheer number of archaeological sites that are within my study area, approximately 40 in total. LAMP artifacts can range from something as big as an entire hull of a 200-year-old schooner to something as small as a thimble or a peach pit from 200 plus years ago. For the remainder of my presentation today, just to clarify, I'm going to be referring to several locations in my study area. These include the St. Augustine Inlet itself, Anastasia State Park, which may be referred to as Bird or Conch Island, depending upon the year that we're discussing, Salt Run, which is an estuary, Davis Shores, the Matanzas River, the historic downtown St. Augustine itself, the Tolomato River, and then the Volano Peninsula. My study area consists of approximately 25 square kilometers, and inside of it there are littoral oceans, lagoons, sandy beaches, salt marshes, developed urban areas, and maritime hammocks. Each one of these unique ecosystems and settings provides different geological and geophysical factors that have been shifted throughout the last 4 centuries. There are 3 classes of types of factors that have been influencing the inlet's geomorphology over the last 450 years. These include climatic, hydrological, and anthropogenic influences. Climatically, the area is prone to hurricanes, nor'easterns, and strong storms. Hydrologically, we have to deal with drainage from the Tolomato and Matanzas rivers, in addition to sediment movements in the area. And finally, the human influence, which has been the result of dredging operations at the turn of the century, an explosion in development in the region, and also U.S. Army Corps of Engineer-led renourishment efforts for the dunes and local waterways. So what is the process or the focus of my study? You're kind of looking at it. It's the moving inlet. Looking at these 2 navigational charts from 1943, one to the present day, we can see how the inlet's mouth has moved through time. Its precise movement, however, is less understood. So the problem that my study and my project is trying to address is, despite its long history, no concise historical understanding of the inlet's geomorphology exists. This creates constant frustration and debate amongst local historians and maritime archaeologists. Whoops, sorry. In this study, I aim to create a historical cartographic record for the St. Augustine Inlet and its surrounding area from 1589 to the present 2022. The resulting sequence of georeference maps will aid local, state, and national organizations to anticipate the discovery of archaeological or cultural assets, plan for mitigation efforts in the event of climate change-induced sea level rise, or prepare recovery efforts in the aftermath of the strong hurricane activity that is increasing in both intensity and occurrence. Now, this is not my first attempt to map the inlet. In 2020, I assisted the LAMP team as part of a NOAA grant by producing a series of coastal data sets using historic cartographic elements. While these data sets proved useful for the LAMP team, what it lacked was a bathymetry layer or depth analysis. That is to say, we do not know how the inlet has changed underneath the surface of the water. So I began this project by first conducting a rigorous literature review of similar coastal studies, looking to determine and understand the movements of sediments and coastal features. I used a combination of Penn State's digital library collections, JSTOR, and of course Google Scholar to review studies. From this literature review, 4 themes became apparent in each of the studies reviewed. The first of these themes presented in the literature review was the importance of understanding the historical context for the geomorphologic study itself. Orman, Moran, and Larson explained that typically the more intricate or longer the time span that the study is, the longer the historical review portion should be as well. Historical review should consider various factors critical to understanding the study area's geomorphology. Factors such as geology, the climate, hydrology, human factors, including demographic trends and explicit human interactions with their environment, and finally, socioeconomic considerations that might explain why humans have made the choices they've made to the landscape throughout time. The next theme that was present focused on how specific maps were chosen for a historical georeference study. Fernandez and Montblanc were very interesting in this regard, as they provide me the most comprehensive overview of what sort of factors should go into reviewing their georeference studies. So studying a map spatiotemporal relevance to the study area, the availability that a team has to access to historical documents, for scale between map data sets, positional accuracy of one map in relation to the next map in a temporal sequence, and finally, the age of maps, especially if a map is made prior to the 1800s. As van der Waal and Pai explain in their 2003 study, primarily it was after the 1800s that more modern trigonometric concepts were applied to surveying. And thus, as you can see in the images to the right here, we have a general increase in the overall accuracy of cartographic elements. Next, we have the methodologies used for georeferencing historical coastal projects. Long-term sequential spatiotemporal change studies. It is ideal to have the following: use several map samples in the study area, make sure that all maps are set to the same scale, ensure that there's a uniform coordinate system projection for local, horizontal, and vertical datums. Ideally have between 3 to 10 control points throughout each time period that is being reviewed, and try to have regularly spaced intervals of time, i.e. maps should be every 20 years or so. The final and most interesting theme that was touched upon in my studies is how bathymetry data was recorded and what special considerations must be considered when using historical bathymetry facts. In this area, van der Waal and Pry and Robinson were seminal in understanding how bathymetry has changed and how we have been recording depth readings throughout the past centuries. The first thing that they mention is dubious accuracy before the advent of modern sound distancing technology such as sonar. Early forms of sounding data was typically done with a lead line, which is essentially just a lead weight attached to the end of a rope, or sounding rods, which were long poles used to measure depth. We can imagine how difficult it might have been to row out in the surf and try to use a lead line or a sounding rod back 200 years ago. Additionally, van der Waal and Pry mentioned rectifying tidal datums for uniformity, correcting for mean sea level rise in the study areas, in addition to identifying and confirming what is meant by the term coastline. Different surveyors may have had different terms or different understandings of what point in the tidal datum was meant to be the coastline, i.e. is it taken at high tide, at low tide, or somewhere in between, in addition to converting units of measurement to a uniform standard and ensuring uniform map projection in coordinate systems. To better describe the geomorphological changes that have occurred in the inlet, I've included a brief historical review of the study area. The maps seen in this section of my presentation have been used in my previous attempts to monitor the shifting inlet and will also be incorporated into my final project methodology. I've broken this historical review down into 8 distinct time periods that are commonly used by local archaeological and historical communities. So first off, there's the pre-Columbian period, which is the time period before the first European arrived in North America. These early accounts are not incredibly accurate. The earliest that we count of the St. Augustine area comes from a journal entry of a Franciscan friar named Herrera, who was with Juan Ponce de Leon in his exploration of La Florida in 1513. The journal entry made in late August indicates that Ponce de Leon's vessels were able to go into and out of the inlet, which is significant because, again, the vessels that Ponce de Leon would have been using in his fleet typically would have been a caravel type ship that you see here, which usually has less than 5 foot of draft underneath it, telling us that these inlets have historically been very shallow. As we can see in the lithograph from French illustrator and explorer Jacques Lamonnier, early Europeans were aware of the shallow and unpredictable inlets. These would force the larger vessels to remain at sea, and smaller vessels being the safest means of exploring the lagoons and inlets. We can also see what appears to be shallow water salt marshes and other porous sand island land formations. Additionally, from depictions of the indigenous populations, we can see that they were keenly aware of the difficulties of going up and down these estuaries and inlets. The next time period is the first Spanish period. This is synonymous with the first of the region, early European and indigenous population contact and colonial settlement. Early maps were crude and have odd dimensions that lack trigonometric precision that later maps will display. As we can see here in our 2 examples, on the left is the Boadzio map, which was made in 1589, and the silver map made in 1740. These represent the earliest cartographic representations of the settlement of St. Augustine. Early maps place the inlet closer to the modern entrance of the inlet itself, with a series of sandbars and shoals that force vessels to approach from the south. We can again see large navies and vessels are kept out at sea. Smaller vessels are used to land ashore or to bring goods into the port itself. And likewise, we can see the dangers present in the shifting sandbars of the inlet itself. What's important with these 2 map elements is that they're going to represent my 2 earliest cartographic data sets. We have in them the first 2 control points of my study area, which is the Old Spanish Watchtower and the first St. Augustine Lighthouse, which was originally a Spanish mission and/or fortress. The British period saw major advances in surveying and sounding data set. The Heard map, which we see here to the right, was produced in 1756, provides the most comprehensive depth analysis of the inlet and a recommended approach pattern for ships entering the inlet itself. We can also see and observe growing expanses of sandy shoals and also the difficult, that would go on to form into Anastasia State Park. Additionally, we can also see the Old St. Augustine Lighthouse clearly labeled for the first time. This trend continues on into later maps. Again, the presence of the sandy shoals at the entrance proved difficult, and we see that the map makers are very concerned with making sure that ships are able to get into the port. During the second Spanish period, we saw a regression in the types of maps that were produced. Often they tend to be less data focused and also lack any bathymetry data. Again, though, we can see a general movement. We now have 3 shoals that we're dealing with here. Finally, during the American territory and statehood periods, we get our first trigonometrically derived and accurately surveyed coastal map as part of the United States Office of Coastal Survey. We can clearly see the inlet bathymetry data being recorded. We can also now start to see that those sandy shoals are becoming sand islands or more permanent fixtures in the inlet's waterways. During the Reconstruction and Resort period, we had a boom in maritime business in St. Augustine, with the influx from northern Yankee transplants brought a renewed livelihood to the city and the surrounding areas. As we can see, in terms of development, Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway and his development and construction of the resorts in the downtown St. Augustine area are still there today. This, of course, required tremendous amounts of dredging, swamp draining, and building up of land soil. This put a lot of sediment into the waterways. We also had the Florida Inland Navigational District and the Florida Coastline Canal and Transportation Company trying to form the Florida intercoastal that is still present today. Again, maps from this time period show similar concerns, but again, it's still shifting, which is very important in our study area. And again, the green triangles represent the current St. Augustine Lighthouse as a solid control point. During the modern industrial period, St. Augustine begins to become a production center for the Desco Shrimp Boat Company. And we see the most significant geomorphological event taking place in this period. In 1943, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged the inlet to its current extent, thus relegating the southern entrance into St. Augustine as a sand dune complex. And now we have the Anastasia State Park system built up. Today, the inlet is a relatively safe traffic lane. It does require renourishment and restoration efforts on the part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers every 5 to 7 years, where they dredge the entrance to make sure that it's safe for boat traffic. Okay, I will now describe the methodology that I plan to employ to complete my coastline and bathymetry study. On this slide, you can see that my methodology mirrors common practices already employed in similar spatiotemporal geomorphologic GIS studies. First, I plan to gather data with sources including the LAMP Research Library and Database, the USGS, NOAA, and the University of Florida's map libraries. From there, I will georeference these maps, digitize the shoreline elevation bathymetry datasets, generate TINs, and interpolate, which will then lead to interpolation of TINs to DEM rasters. Once I have the rasters formed, I'll conduct error analysis and change analyses. Finally, I hope to export my finished maps to a user-friendly interface. So again, the technology and software used for this project will be a combination of ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online, and several web applications, including the USGS Topo Map Viewer, the Office of Coastal Survey Historical Maps web viewer as well. The first stage of my project involves gathering and collating the maps that I will use, many of which have already been gathered. Each map will be set to a uniform scale and projection, the US Albers State Plane, Florida North. Next, I will georeference these maps using available control points. It's a little hard to see in this image, but these control points represent historical landmarks here in St. Augustine, some dating back to the founding of St. Augustine as early as 1565. The oldest control points include the Castillo de San Marcos, the Governor's House, the Franciscan Barracks, and the Basilica of St. Augustine. The next step of my project will involve digitization of coastlines and the bathymetry soundings. Once the georeferencing is complete, I'll be able to digitize.
Thomas, it sounded like your audio just cut out.
Hello?
Yeah, you're there. So something happened. You went
Okay,
black.
I apologize, folks. The TIN data sets will be converted into DEMs.
Now your screen isn't sharing.
Oh dear. Can everybody see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh boy, let's see here. Okay.
There. See your
See my-
screen.
There we go.
There you
Are we
go.
back?
Go back one slide.
Yes, sir.
There you go. That's where you cut out.
Oh shoot. Okay. So
No worries.
again, basically,
No worries.
again, I'll be trying to convert coastline vector, converting my all my coastline vectors that I digitized into a uniform mean low water vector datum, which is the same that is used by NOAA's navigational charts today. Additionally, I will be using converting my bathymetry soundings into either contour line data sets with depth or sounding points into depth points as well. The next stage will be to convert these TINs into DEM rasters. Once this is done, I will be able to subject my study areas to an accuracy assessment for known years or years where it's easy enough to conduct such studies. Finally, I will conduct a change analysis to quantify the amount of sediment movement observed over the various study periods. There are, of course, several concerns and considerations in my methodology right now, including incomplete bathymetry data sets for certain years. The accuracy from earlier maps could be subpar or non-existent in some maps, irregularity within title datums that may be impossible to rectify, and a lack of control points in many of the older maps could produce errors or inaccuracies. The final step will be to export my data sets, both the coastline, the depth rasters, to a web-based time slider application that can be easily viewed by my target stakeholders. The slider will show not only where the coastlines and seafloors have shifted, but also how much sediment has been relocated in each of these time periods. Of course, my target users are ideally archaeologists, historians, researchers, local, state, and federal government agencies, and also the curious general public. A time frame for my study is a little bit shortened just because a lot of the background gathering of data and georeferencing has already been taken place for my 2020 study for the NOAA grant. However, I begin in May to June, securing additional historic and modern navigational maps, begin the process of georeferencing historic maps that are not already georeferenced. Next, in June, July, generating these historic data sets or shapefiles, producing contour bathymetry line shapefiles and sounding point data shapefiles as well. Generating 10 layers in bathymetry data sets should take place in the summertime. Ideally, in August and September, I'll be able to review the results and assess my study for accuracies. Finally, in September, October, I'll be able to prepare the web viewer, slider tool, and any other final products that I plan to release. Ideally, I hope to, in November, prepare my official project paper, and then come December, present my project and findings to the capstone committee and to separate scholarly organization. In my case, I plan on revealing or presenting my findings to the St. Augustine Historical Society. The anticipated results from my study include observing the greatest geomorphic variety in time periods before the dredging operations of the 1940s. I anticipate that the location of the inlet throughout time will match with the presumed age of shipwrecks uncovered by the LAMP team. That is to say, shipwrecks from the mid-1700s should line up with where the inlet was during the mid-1700s. I do also anticipate to see some degree of sea level rise within the study area, most dynamically within the past 6 decades. And finally, I would produce the publicly accessible time slider web application that will allow researchers and local stakeholders to understand the geomorphology of the inlet from the past 400 years. Future work has already been considered with the LAMP team. The next location that they would like to see a similar project done is the Matanzas Inlet. Matanzas Inlet is the southern entrance to the Port of St. Augustine. It shares many of the same hydrology, history, and concerns about historical accuracy of its maps. However, there are fewer data sets from which to pull. It is exciting to note, though, that we are discovering new shipwrecks as early as just this past spring, adjacent to the mouth of the Matanzas Inlet. So again, there could be many more shipwrecks and discoveries to be made down there. Here is a list of my references I used in my study, and of course, image sources that I used for my presentation. Thank you for your time and consideration. At this time, if anybody has any comments or questions, I would love to hear them and answer them the best I can.
All right, thanks, Thomas, for your presentation. That was a great job. I have to say, you've got one of the most spectacular office views I've ever seen.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, so we have a question for you already. Please make sure to read the question before you respond. That'd be great. Questions in the chat window.
Absolutely. So Anthony asked, super cool project. What are the sorts of things you envision the Historical Society might do with the results from your work? So with the results of the work, we can anticipate working not only with the Historical Society and other local archaeologists to perhaps pool resources and spearhead future surveys and dig sites to find new shipwrecks, but also perhaps more importantly is to preserve the sensitive archaeological sites that we're already working on right now. Again, 2016, we had Hurricane Irma cross over the city of St. Augustine, resulting in tremendous amounts of damage to our archaeological sites and areas in the field that we are still recovering artifacts. So I would anticipate them being able to utilize that sort of information would be most valuable.
While others are putting questions together, I have a question for you. One of the telling aspects of the evolution of cartographic representation has been the movement of the low, high, oblique view to an orthogonal view of a landscape. Many of the low and high oblique perspectives that you showed with your maps early on lack coordinate systems, but yet you reference certain objects there as being your control point. So how are you going to rectify the coordinate system issue with those low and high oblique views?
So for certain earlier data sets, definitely using just the maps themselves may not be enough. One thing that I'm working on with a local researcher here in town, a gentleman named John Hill, he is actually gone through and curated those early surveyor notes. We still have those logs, or they're accessible either in Spanish archives or in archives in the city of London, England, that we can try to access or reach out for to try to kind of better understand what the surveyor was trying to understand. In terms of, more oblique views, that's going to definitely be the hardest part, and that's where I anticipate seeing the greatest amount of inaccuracies, but still interesting, or at the very least insightful to consider in having that information presented. It's possible that if it's too inaccurate, though, it may not serve the purpose of the project, and so I may need to change the time frame to using more trigonometrically accurate map data sets.
All right, thanks. One real quick thing, I noticed you're going to be dealing with a lot with vertical datums. I just put something in the chat window. National Ocean Service has a program called VDatum, and it is a great tool to convert from the title datums to NAVD 88 or NV, any of the earlier datums that the US produced. And you can go backwards too. And St. Augustine's right on the coast, and VDatum is very, very good for coastal kinds of locations. So you might want to check that out if you're going to be dealing with any kind of vertical datum transformations. Absolutely.
It looks like I got one more question in the chat. It's tricky. On one hand, you'll want to publicize the results of your work. On the other hand, doing it so you'll make it easier for others to potentially poach from archaeological sites. I'm not sure what I would propose to do with that situation, except maybe to reserve the highest resolution results for trusted partners. That's also very true. Again, I was able to showcase where we have found shipwrecks with the express consideration that I do not zoom in to any larger scale or try to keep it such that it's vague enough, because we do have an issue with local black market treasure hunters here in St. Augustine. So again, that's definitely an important consideration. Thank you.
All right, Thomas, great job, great presentation. If you can, all right, stop sharing, that's great. Philip, if you can start sharing your screen. Thomas, if you want to place your email contact in the chat, if someone has a follow-up question, that'd be great. All right, we see your screen, Philip. Can you do an
Great.
audio check for us?
You can hear me, right?
Yes, good.
Okay. So this is so for my capstone proposal, I'm focusing on unlocking the rovers of Mars. This was done with a lot of help from Ryan Baxter. This was my advisor for all of this, and I've been working on it for a while since I was in that proposal class with Anthony Robinson. So to continue, what would be this? What the overview of what I'm doing for this capstone proposal is be focusing on the rover Perseverance. I'll be talking about Mars coordinate systems, previous apps that use Mars, web app APIs, the rover data, and the anticipated results that I hope to get out of this proposal and capstone overall. So my overall project goals is to make a web app of Mars, and this be utilizing the Mars rover Perseverance, which I'll go into detail in later slides. And that is the most recent rover that has landed on Mars. And I'll be using location and imagery data that is provided through NASA. I'll be making a web app using the web app API, support multiple base maps, and it'll try to be accessible and clear for multiple audiences. It'll try to focus more on scientists, Mars enthusiasts, and students, and less on the general public, as there are definitely complications arising from trying to make it too broad of an audience. And then it'll hope to add additional functionality beyond what is found currently in the Mars maps available. So to start, I want to give an example of what a web app looks like. So the example I'm using here is the project I did for Geog 863, which was a future rockets of the world, where you click on a rocket and it gives you a future rocket launch date and gives you a countdown timer for each rocket. This is an example of a SpaceX launch that was happening in 61 days from that point. The key points I want to give out for this is that it has base map support, it has clear data, it has additional functionality that exists beyond just a web map, which is the countdown timer and the sidebar. This is actually using Esri's JavaScript API, which has the pop-ups disabled and letting it use a sidebar. And it's also accessible so people understand what the map is and what it's operating with. So to dive in, I wanted to explain first what rovers are and what the overall data I hope to get out of Perseverance itself. So rovers are unmanned aerial vehicles. They're deployed to planets for research. It's often due to inhospitable conditions, but it's also often due to manned missions taking far too long to reach these planets, and they wish to get research done beforehand. The first rover to Mars was in 1987. It was called Sojourner. It was more of a proof of concept just to show whether or not they could have a rover land on Mars. That was followed by Spirit and Opportunity. They landed in pair. Curiosity was the second most recent back in 2013, and Perseverance was launched in 2020 and it landed in 2021. Most of the rovers, except for Sojourner, have been sent to Mars to explore for evidence of current or previous extraterrestrial life. This does not mean Martians usually means just bacterial life, and they tried in previous attempts have been looking for bacteria in geological formations. Some look for building blocks. In this case, this particular rover Perseverance, which is shown in the image on the right, is focusing on looking for building blocks of life. Along with this mission, they launched a little helicopter, which was trying to show a proof of concept that it could have drones fly in low atmospheric conditions, like on Mars, which happen to be very thin, which happens to have a very thin atmosphere. It was successful, and it's still flying around today. So Perseverance, it may look misleading at first, because when you think of a rover, I first thought it was the size of an RC car. In reality, it's the size of a small sedan. It weighs about a ton, and it has several instruments on it, which I'm going to hammer off quickly. So RIMFAX is the first one. RIMFAX is a subsurface radar. So if you've ever used a ground penetrating radar, which looks like, to me, it looks like a lawnmower that you drag on the floor, that reveals subsurface conditions. If you've ever seen Jurassic Park 3, they have a really weird not accurate, but a way of where they shoot a shotgun into the ground to show and send a shock wave to see if there's dinosaur bones below. But this is basically just a very high, very modernized version of a ground penetrating radar that allows them to see what's below the surface. The next instrument is MOXIE. MOXIE is part of a separate mission. It was designed to detect, do oxygen conversion from CO2. It is mainly used as to test for future manned missions to Mars, whether or not they can possibly do that to have supporting systems when they get there. PIXL is an X-ray spectrometer. It operates much like an XRF, if you know what X-ray fluorescence is, which is you send a material through ionized gas and it produces a wavelength of light that detects, and they use that to detect elemental abundance. There's Sherlock, which is similar to PIXL, but operates under ultraviolet light. And then Watson has its own little camera fixed. That's this camera that's specifically for the instrument itself. We then have META, which is a weather station. META, it collects everything from wind speeds to temperature, to wind direction, to barometric pressure. And then we have SuperCam, which is a laser microimager. It has fires a laser at a site and uses image recognition along with a laser to detect what it's looking at. So it gives some idea to the rover what it's looking at, what direction it should be heading to look for any prime targets for research. And then we have MASTCAM. And MASTCAM is the most important in this proposal because that's what's going to be collecting all the imagery. And it has zoomable panoramic cameras, which I'll show quickly in this little video. And basically here, it shows the whole rover, but specifically we're going to zoom in around the MASTCAM. And the MASTCAM here focuses on these sets of cameras that can do panoramic camera view, which mostly they're going to be in black and white imagery. And they'll take about 300 pictures a day. Sometimes they're in color, and sometimes they'll do, as I said, do panoramic views, which will involve a lot of images at once. They take about images about 2 megapixel resolution. That is primarily because of power conservation. But one of the key aspects that it has, unlike most modern phones and most modern cameras, is that its zoom does not degrade the quality. So it can take very high powered imagery at very long range, which means it has very strong telescopic cameras on it. And that allows it to take very detailed imagery of what it needs to research. So moving out of rovers and moving into Mars coordinate systems. Mars coordinate systems are important for here because we are not dealing with Earth and we cannot use Earth-based coordinate systems. Mars is smaller than Earth, it's about half the size, and it cannot operate under the same coordinate system that we do. And you have many coordinate systems to begin with. So I'm going to go over a brief what Mars coordinate systems are and what we deal with them. But first, I want to go over what coordinate systems are in the most general sense. So we have the geographic coordinate systems. Geographic coordinate systems operate under the lat long coordinates. They operate under, we're doing with spheres and spheroidals and geoids and ellipsoids. And in this case, we're dealing with locating objects more or less. We don't tend to use geographic coordinate systems very often when we're working with navigation systems and maps. We tend to use with projected. I'll give you an example on the right with the OpenStreetMaps, which tends to use the Mercator. But the main issue when you take for going from geographic to projected is you get a lot of distortion or in a certain way or another. And there's often a balancing act between shape, area, and angle and distance. And you often, for this example, you have shapes not distorted, but area significantly, judging by the fact that Greenland is almost half the size of Africa in this image, when it in reality is definitely not, and it's much, much smaller. So when we look at Mars coordinate systems, so this is an example from Esri using ArcGIS Pro, and we see here that Mars, the key thing here is that we're looking at the Esri supported ones, and the importance for that is because we want to be able to use whatever is the general supported coordinate systems. There are about 8 that are supported and found on EPSG's website, but we do not care about all of them because not all of them are supported by most web API systems. In this example, we have 5. 2 of them are their moons, so we can't use those. But we have 3, Mars 1979, Mars 2000, and Mars 2000 sphere. go more into detail on that, Mars 1979, Mars 2000, 2000 sphere, I looked at the details of each of the coordinate systems. And we care more about the bottom rows, which in this case are detailing the semi-major, the spheroid, the semi-minor axis, and the inverse flattening. And as you can see here, the difference between 1979 and 2000, there's not much explanation. And after significant research, they do not really explain why they do the jumps, but typically from experience from previous courses, typically the jumps are due to the improvement in trying to make the accurately reduce the amount of error and then reduce the amount of distortion created by these, which explains like the slight variations, which is why Mars 2000 was the more current one used. Mars 2000 sphere has a strong difference in the fact that it's using inverse flattening of 0, which means it is a sphere and it's not doing a spheroid, and it's not doing ellipsoid in this case. And that one is actually the most commonly used for most of the web app applications that are currently available for Mars. To give an idea of how it compares against an Earth-based system, I compared against WGS 1984, which is one of the most common geographic coordinate systems we have. You can see here that the key difference here, besides the inverse flattening being significantly different, is the fact that the semi-major and semi-minor axes are about half for Mars compared to Earth, which goes down the idea that Mars is about half the size of Earth in the first place. So now we know that we only have three of these, and it's important to note that none of these Mars coordinate systems are projected. So that becomes a problem later on that I have to note, is the fact that if I want to make a web app or even just a map in general, it's going to be using a geographic coordinate system as its base, which is going to be quote unquote forcibly projected, and it's going to create some distortion that has to be noted later. So there are previous apps that have been made of Mars, and it's important to go over them. There are primarily two of them. Well, there's three. There's two from NASA and there's one from Google. So for Google made a Mars map some significant amount of time ago. If you look very closely, you notice that if you ever looked at older Google Maps systems, this is one of their oldest Google Map user interfaces. You can see by the push pins, it has a look much like a very old version of Google Earth. Here, what you can see here is it has three versions of base maps as elevation, visible, and infrared. It also has a top bar that has different key aspects like regions, mountains, plains, craters. As you can see here, there is no reference layer, which I'm going to state, which means that there's no labeling here. That does not tell me which craters which. It does not tell me anything beyond. The push pins tell me that, but there's no overlying layer like you would normally see with like an Esri map or a navigation map. So if I click on one of these, I get something like plains. So plains, for instance, this will list all the plains that are in the region, and overall in Mars overall. And you can click on one of them, for instance, like this, and it will tell you what the crater's name is. It'll tell you where it is, tell you what the source was from, there's an article, usually the discovery date, or when there was a rover that was passing, or whether or not there was a satellite overhead. But you can see here, the user interface is a bit clunky, it's a bit old. It does not really give you it's very hard for someone to navigate and try to find things within proximity to each other. If they were looking for one specific crater in relation to another, it's not really the most useful tool. But it does have very clear base map imagery, even though it may be a bit dated now. And it is a significant map overall. When comparing it against NASA's, so this is NASA's, and this is specifically for Perseverance itself. So Perseverance has its own web app, which you can see here. Actually, it shows a little helicopter, which is evident of the helicopter's current location at that day. And what you can see here is it's composed of multiple features, and it's hard to see on this image, but it has points which are related to the rover's location day to day, and then the line. So the polyline is showing the path it traveled between each point. And in fact, if you click on the line, it will tell you the distance it traveled that day to day. Beyond that, it also gives you the day in sol units, which I'll go over a little bit later. And then it has the distance traveled. And then if you notice, they have these little squares And each square is this like important area it wants to show off. So that's one of the, I clicked on one and it says surface view Van Zyl overlook. Before I continue, I wanted to also note that here that this has a base map, but the base map switching is not seamless. It does have issues, and it's something I cannot explore too far into because every time I try to do it, it would break the map. So this actually really only has one base map we're going to focus on. It has multi-layers to the base map, but it's not allowing you to switch them out. So when you click on that, and I know see the little surface view, you go to then this, which is so that rover took a ton of images that day. And it was likely because it's a famous location. And for this was a Mars helicopter deployment site. So what you can do here is you can click and you can rotate in space, because what it did, it took all the images, it took them tessellated them into a mosaic and made them into a 3D, almost virtual reality experience where you can rotate and look around and you can travel beyond where the rover is. And that is the sort of the ability of the rover to take such high quality images in rapid succession. If you notice here, the problem though is that it only has the locations that are squares here. It does not do every location. And it will be important to note that not there, if you click on any other point besides those squares, it will not show you a photo of that day. So when you compare the two, you show that, you know, the NASA one shows all Perseverance locations. Google's does have Perseverance, but it does not tell you, it tells you where it landed, it doesn't tell you any more than that. The NASA's has limited base map functionality, while Google's has UI that's lacking in accessibility and is quite dated. The pop-ups are a bit disorganized for Google. They don't really give you much detail beyond just sort of basic information. NASA's has the fancy 3D mosaics, but they're very limited on locations. So the photos are only available on those key locations. It does have a reference layer. It does not show it very clearly in that image, but if you zoom out, you'll see like labels for large trenches and craters, whereas Google's does not have any reference layer. So for this whole project, like I wanted to figure out how I got the data, and this data took a lot of work to actually hunt for. As I started with, I wanted to get point data for the Perseverance from day to day, maybe the line data for the rover path. The point data was more important. I definitely wanted to make it so that when you clicked on a rover imagery, you got a pop-up from the point data to give you the imagery for that day. And I wanted to possibly have additional data be affixed to the Perseverance's location that would also include multiple base maps. The data itself so far on this little rover's journey, so this is where it currently was a few days ago. No, more like a week ago at this point. They have 414 waypoints, which cover about 6.3 miles. And they're all in Sol units. Sol units is not a standardized unit that we can use for most cases. We're not using Gregorian calendar here because Mars has a different day cycle than Earth does. Sol units are Mars days. So they start, Sol day 1 was when when the Mars rover landed. There is a conversion factor that they did provide within the data that I'll note later, but the important thing here is that Sol days is what they use for the main way to corroborate a rover's point from a day-to-day basis. So how do we extract the data? So the way I found to extract the data was I was actually hunting around. I found this discussion post online for developers that wanted to make Mars maps. And they found out that after data mining this RSS feed, so an RSS feed is like a newsletter that's auto-generated. And when they hunted around, they found that Perseverance had one. And when they dug into it, they found out there was an API, which is an application programmable interface, but in this case, it's pulling data from a NASA server that tells them what the rover has been doing day to day. So when you do all this work and you figure out how to call it, you get this sort of blob of information after going and pulling the JSON file out. This follows a kind of a typical quote unquote GeoJSON format. It's not entirely a perfect GeoJSON format. So if you zoom in a little bit further, I'll give you an example about the overall day-to-day, what it would look like. So for example, this is day 16 of the rover's journey. And if you look a little bit, if you look at the bottom row, you see type point coordinates, and that's how you get the coordinate data for the day-to-day for the rover. And that is through calling the API. And that's the interesting part about that. It means that this map can be updated daily for the rover. And that means it can be live data. I mean, I won't be local data in that case. So when I was trying to make a map for this and I was trying to figure out how to do it, I was thinking about what are the good ways to do it? What are good, you have to think about the web app APIs, and the web app APIs are different from calling from NASA's system. Web app APIs are effectively, as I would call it, complex libraries that basically you call. There are many different companies that make them, and there's also some open source variants. They're somewhat evenly split, but more proprietary. This is an example on the right of a code pen situation where they do like a sample code of showing how it works. This is Esri's side. This is our JS API for JavaScript. They also call it Esri.js. And this is giving an example of them making a web app out of it. So the common web app APIs you have available range from Mapbox to Leaflet to ArcGIS API for JavaScript to Open Layers, and there's several others that I'm not going to list, but they definitely exist. Mapbox and ArcGIS API for JavaScript, those two are proprietary. They're each owned by their own company. Leaflet and Open Layers are open source. And it came down to sort of like which one is more important in this case. Which one do I care about more? Are the cost benefits of one better than the other? So when I broke them down, I focused on two, and I focused one on Esri.js versus Leaflet, because Esri.js is the most common proprietary one and is the most accessible proprietary one. And Leaflet is also the most accessible open source one. So comparing the two, you had ArcGIS API for JavaScript was proprietary. It had limited functionality, which means out of the box functionality, I call it, which means it's like you get very basic. You can't expand, you can't add stuff to it unless you start doing some like finicky ways and sneaky ways of doing about, like I did with my future rocket launches. But it does have extensive documentation. It means the map can be built quickly. Leaflet is open source. It has expandable functionality, which means you can go into forums and find additional features to tack onto your map. It has very limited documentation to start though. And that means you have to rely on other users to make your map. And that makes it a little bit complicated to self-start your maps. So what do I hope to get out of this, this overall proposal and later capstone is that I wanted to go through a developmental process, and I wanted to make the process very clean and easy to understand for myself so that if I made a mistake or something went wrong, especially when it comes to coding, I was able to fall back to a previous stage so that I could make sure that I could start over or continue or be able to just use that one as the project itself. So in a very basic timeline, I was hoping that in June, I would finalize the feedback and start figuring out the data extraction, figuring out how to properly pull out key coordinates out of each day-to-day. July would be more of the data processing and preparing a working web map, just making a very basic map that shows the data, not into an app feature yet. And then start getting the pop-ups working and then moving into custom pop-ups where I start showing the imagery and adding additional features in August, and then making the web design that actually houses this whole map in this app then, and then moving on to bug fixing and finalizing in October. So to give a basic idea, this would be a wireframe of what I would hope to get out of this, where you have the little rover on its little journey and has a clear base map, has the ability to switch base maps. You can be able to search by day. And when you click on one of the points, so if you see like the highlighted point next to the rover, it would give like an image, and that's an actual image from the rover on a certain day. And it would give you information. It may let you click on a link, and it'll tell you about what you were looking at, and maybe actually give you all the images for that day, which may be using a different library that gives you ability to do a slideshow of many images at once. And so that's my references. And then any questions?
All right, thanks, Philip. That's a very interesting capstone project, definitely. Looks like you have a question already in the chat window.
Sure. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so from Dan, Philip, very interesting proposal and initiative. Thank you. In your research or published material, did you note any obvious positional errors in mapping Mars, like by an organization that should have known better? The thing I found to be very difficult so far when I was doing the research is that there was so little data available on when they were mapping Mars, to the point that I had to like look at EPSG sites to try to figure out whether or not they told me, whether or not they gave me data on what the coordinate system was. I mean, it took Ryan to point out that, you know, ArcGIS luckily gave me the information on each coordinate system. So I wasn't able to find any positional. I know that there are definitely some obvious positional errors that they're doing, especially by NASA, but I wasn't able to contact them to actually get more information out of them. So I was very heavily relying on what they provided through their websites and whatever papers they wrote specifically. And sorry, so Chet said, "Hi Philip, great proposal. Would you consider using a Python script to scrape the rover position data from the NASA server?" It's certainly possible. I tend to not mix that. When I do the program, I tend to stick with one, especially because my mind is not the best at switching programming languages. But Python is definitely a route. I think that would be better, I think, for more of the desktop end application using more of ArcPy. But for the JavaScript end, I was hoping to do more of a server-side host that would use Node, and hopefully when it would just scrape and auto create a GeoJSON every day, and it would just repopulate it and do the proper calls and build a GeoJSON that would allow me to just pull the data in every day and daily, which would allow the data to be constantly updated. So if someone looked tomorrow, it would have the rover position tomorrow, which I think would be a very great feature. And then Clint said, "Very interesting project. I see where you obtain the daily location of the rover. Where does the daily photo data, and where will they be part of the application?" That's a very good question. So for that one, what I planned on doing was that, so that the SOL units was the key thing I mentioned earlier, and what that allows me to do is that the photo API that NASA has that lets you pull photos from their rover is based on SOL units. So SOL units is that tie that allows you to pull data and actually get the imagery, and the imagery comes in usually just the form of a link for the photo, and then you can use the photo and just populate the map, the web map with all the photos of that day. Let's see. All right, so let's see. Thank you, Dan, for the comment. And then let's see. So we have another question, and so that one. So let's see. Hey Philip, this is amazing. The future Mars missions will be definitely a growing field for GIS and remote sensing professionals. This app sounds like a great way to bring the exploration of Red Planet more accessible to the general viewer. Do you have any plans for specialized apps for students, children, astrophysicists, general science enthusiasts? So for that one, I think that, so the difficult part, I think, is that building these apps themselves take significant amount of time. It took me about almost half a course to build just the future rocket launches map. So definitely in the future, it could be future work that would be more accessible to different audiences. I think that it definitely involves a lot more work to make the map accessible to an audience that is more is a younger audience, because you have to definitely change the way you do the website design overall. But definitely to start, it would definitely be more of the GIS professionals and GIS and just science students. I think my map can definitely, the web app could definitely handle high school and up from that point. But I think once you start reaching the younger audiences, you definitely have to do a lot more inherent front end design to make it more accessible.
All right. Thanks again, Philip, for your presentation. Great job. If you want to put your contact info in the chat,
For sure.
someone wants to follow up with you, that'd be great. And next up, we have Peter Timoshenko.
Hello, let me just share. Can everybody see my screen?
Not yet. We hear you.
Okay.
Looks promising. There we go.
Perfect.
All right. Everything looks good. So whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Back to Earth. I'm going to be talking about hibernaculum site selection for eastern box turtles as a method to understand patterns, preferences, and behaviors in order to enhance some conservation efforts. I'm going to provide an outline where I'll cover a little bit of my personal background, some of my interest in eastern box turtle conservation, the actual project, the Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust, and give everybody a little bit of background on eastern box turtles, as there's a lot of information to cover. I will cover some previous research on variables from demographic variability to fidelity and home range preferences. Additionally, I'll cover some key research limitations with eastern box turtle studies. There are three main objectives associated with this project. That is data validation and data extraction, a habitat analysis, and a behavior analysis. I'll cover each method briefly with the expected outcomes and a timeline as well. A little bit of my background. I was formerly trained as a biologist with a passion for GIS and some landscape modeling. Throughout my undergraduate and my post-undergraduate work, I worked on ecological modeling for wildlife, specifically with brook trout and aquatic species, but that quickly translated to terrestrial animals, including eastern box turtles. I worked as a wildlife habitat development and environmental surveying technician for a few years, which you'll see is how I developed a passion for eastern box turtles. While working for the Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust, I was heavily involved in their data collection, their data processing, the analysis, as well as their data management, publications, and providing trainings. Currently, I'm the GIS program manager. I took a little bit of a leap about a year ago. So some of this project I had started before while I was working for the Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust, and I still work with them to help them maintain a lot of their workflows. A little bit about eastern box turtles and a species history. At first, box turtles aren't very big. They're about 150 centimeters or so, or 150 centimeters, 150 millimeters would be a very little one. They average on size about 7 to 9 inches. They are common from along the East Coast, from Maine to Florida. Box turtles are unique because they can completely retract into their shell, and they range in color from bright yellow to orange, but depending on the time of year, they can be very dull. They're always measured along their carapace shell because they can retract inside their body. That's the only way to get a really consistent measure across populations. And they are a very long-lived species. They typically range between 30 and 45 years, but throughout the studies over the last 100 years, individuals have been found with carved dates in them, which estimates their age to be about 90 years old. So nobody really knows how long they live, but they're highly variable. Population history, they have been a species in, they've been studied for about 100 years. They are currently experiencing population decline. This is typically due to the pet industry and a very slow maturation time. They don't lay a lot of eggs, and there's a pretty low survivability. Currently, eastern box turtles are not federally listed. Every state in which they are present does have them listed at least vulnerable. So there's been a pretty big effort to enhance eastern box turtle populations throughout their range. Okay. Eastern box turtle research has been occurring for about 100 years. They are used as a model species. They're a model species for a few different reasons. The species longevity makes it really unique. It's really neat to have a species that will last and can persist through the environment for a really long time. Their geospatial range is another factor why they're used, because they do exist throughout the entire East Coast, but them as an individual typically have a very small home range. And they have very low mobility. So they don't move very far. They're not very big, they don't move very far, and they live a long time, which makes them a really interesting animal to study behavioral patterns and be able to relate that across other reptiles. Eastern box turtle research focuses on a ton of variables. Some key ones include demographic variability. They have shown to have differences between males and females, and juveniles versus adults. Translocated status. Translocated turtle is a individual that was removed from its native location. And studies have shown that native individuals have certain trends and behaviors, but once a turtle has been relocated, those can totally shift, which affect the conservation status and conservation efforts for different areas. Research on juveniles is pretty difficult. They average in size about a silver dollar, and trying to find a silver dollar in the ground that they look exactly alike is very hard. Most juvenile studies deal exclusively with translocated turtles, typically coming from like rehabilitation centers. Population fragmentation is a really key topic for research. As we continue to fragment the environment, the turtles are affected. They often get hit crossing roads, or they end up in ditches, or they end up along hiking trails, and people tend to pick them up, relocate them just to try to get them off the roads. And this can affect a lot of their behaviors and where they choose to be, and whether or not they ever make it back to their home range. Disease. There are a few different diseases that affect reptiles. Ranavirus is the #1 threat. It has been around a long time. Circa 2005 to circa 2010, there was a very big effort. The eastern box turtles experienced a really rapid decline in populations. It was about a 30% death rate associated with populations that had a high infection rate. So moving on, their habitat, a lot of habitat studies have occurred over the course of 100 years. These typically refer to habitat composition and what is relevant to the turtle in itself. You'll find some home range. They typically deal with minimum convex polygons that justify behaviors based on the demographic variables. Typically, males have a little bit higher home range, females have a little bit smaller, but it's not real consistent. There's been a lot of debate throughout the literature of exactly what kind of animals do what, as well as brumation. Brumation is the state of hibernation that eastern box turtles go into. Hibernation, they do not wake up until the springtime, until the environmental cues hit. With brumation, turtles, say in January, the weather gets a little bit warmer, and they can reanimate and come back up and move, and then go underground again to continue brumation. This research project is going to focus on the hibernaculum site selection. This is a gap throughout literature, throughout the eastern box turtle literature. And it'll provide a little bit of insight as far as what turtles do and how they choose to hibernate, where they choose to hibernate. It will lead to an answer, or at least a suggestion forward as far as contribution status about what should be done. There are lots of research limitations associated with eastern box turtles. The first is a financial limitation. Conducting long-term studies is often really expensive. It's convenient with eastern box turtles. They're not very big, they don't move very far, and they live a long time. But a long-term box turtle study does involve high frequency of observation. Limited study durations. Typically, studies occur between 4 and 6 years. This sounds like a really long time, but when a turtle lives at a minimum for 40 or 50 years and has been shown to live up to 90 and 100 years old, it's a really small portion of the time in which they're alive. And as we all age, our behaviors change. The same thing happens for eastern box turtles. So it's really important to be able to capture the entire life history and not just a snapshot of what's going on, especially for conservation efforts. Observation frequency varies a lot throughout studies. This occurs, typically studies, depending on what they're looking for, will have 1 observation a month for 2, 3, 4 years. This doesn't lead to a lot of observations and can definitely experience a lot of miscues or misinformation as far as results. You may only capture them on hot days or cold days where they tend to move toward a particular area, as well as fragmentation in the landscape. Fragmentation in the landscape has shown to have a dramatic effects. And finding an unfragmented large study site in which you know the history of the individual can be very difficult. That's a big point of emphasis throughout studies. And of course, we have human interaction. When eastern box turtle studies occur, they're often fitted with a transmitter. And when people see a turtle with a transmitter, they tend to pick it up and they move it somewhere, which kind of defeats the point of a location study. Occasionally, they've been shown to be picked up and removed from the study site. They just totally vanish from the middle of their enclosure. And then 2, 3, 4 years later, they often get returned to a pretty similar environment. And as long as the transmitter is still active, they'll show right back up. And they can be, typically those are removed from the studies. Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust is the organization that has been conducting a long-term Eastern Box Turtle study. Their study has been ongoing for 29 years and includes a history on 148 turtles. They have an average frequency of active turtles of about 11 days, which is a really high observation frequency. Their study site is minimally fragmented, with turtles not experiencing any permanent boundaries. They are free to cross boundaries in rural Western Pennsylvania, but rarely cross roads. It's only happened a few times. Surveys were conducted to locate existing populations across the study site. There were numerous studies over the years as the project was warming up, and they could not find any population. So it's fair to say that throughout the study site in Western Pennsylvania, the eastern box turtles were extirpated. This study has a goal. What they're looking to do is enhance eastern box turtle conservation and native population recruitment throughout northwestern Pennsylvania. And this provides a great opportunity because all studies in the turtles are known to be translocated and have a very high observation frequency. This is a pretty unique situation in which we have a really high quality data set over a really long time. The image here on the right is the sanctuary boundary. That is your dedicated unfragmented environment, while the whole area that you can see from the river to the white line just north of these points is your total site. What you can see on the picture there is about 108 turtles with 11 years of spatial data. So they tend to move all over the study site, but have been pretty fortunate to not cross the roads. They are tracked via radio telemetry. It's very useful because it's a silent way to track animals. Transmitters are very small as well. It's very commonly used to understand population dynamics, age and growth studies, and to develop home ranges. Home ranges are typically developed with the first two pictures there located at the top. That's a receiver and an antenna. You can attenuate to a certain frequency, whichever the transmitter for the turtle you're looking for, and you're able to go find the individual. They've been in use for over 60 years. There's only two components, the receivers and the transmitter. You can see the transmitter on the bottom picture attached to a turtle, while the receiver is, of course, above. And they use a VHF signal. They're very common, very easy to attenuate to, and you can go and track your turtles. Transmitters in this study, they last about 3 years. So there is maintenance that is required for these turtles. Every 2.5 to 3 years, the transmitters are replaced. They're not epoxied directly to the turtle. There is a little snap cap that they use. Where all they have to do is pop the snap, replace the transmitter, and the turtle is unaffected as far as behavioral effects. Fidelity is really important. Fidelity is described as spatial distributions and can be categorized as low and high. The picture on the left describes a low site fidelity. These are turtles that do not choose to stay in an area and do not choose to return to an area for a number of years. This, for example, is a juvenile male box turtle known as D37. who over the course of a few years ended up working his way down a hill down toward the river, which is a pretty common path for turtles. And he never returned back to the area where he spent his first 3 years. A high site fidelity is individuals that choose to stay in the same area for a very long point. As you can see, the opening, the field habitat in which those 2 turtles chose to never leave is also highlighted on the low fidelity map to show just how far they could have gone. These 2 turtles were continued to be tracked a lot longer than this image depicts. They each have about 15 years worth of study, and I believe only 1 or 2 of those years they ventured into the forested habitats. That is categorized as very, very high site fidelity. Their database was categorized in an Excel format based off of GPS pools. The data field season is approximately 8 months with pretty high observation intervals, about 11 days. Their GPS technology was started in, I believe, 1993, and they had a character option of 6 characters. So in order to be able to capture all of the information that they needed, which was turtle name, a year, month, day, and any additional thing that they noticed, whether it was a hibernaculum, whether the turtle was sick, whether they lost the turtle that year, or whether it had returned from a previous study, all had to be captured, right? So the active period is between spring and fall, and depending on what the temperature was in the winter, sometimes turtles would wake up and relocate as well. The average observation interval is 11 days. Their average observational period for each turtle is about 13 years. So across the study, a 13-year average is length is pretty impressive. That's a lot of recording. That's a lot of tracking. And there was a total of 148 individuals captured throughout the study. The longest continual period of active data collection was logged as of last year at 23 years. It was quite a streak. New GPS technology has since changed, but they decided to opt and keep the same GIS fields and use them as 6 characters just for data fidelity. Next, I will walk you through a little bit of the data. This is one of the immediate tasks that I faced upon looking at the information. Characters 1 and 2 always denote turtle ID. They were categorized as A, B, C, D, and E based on the life history, whether they were translocated as an adult, translocated as a juvenile, whether they were head started. This is how they were able to keep track of it. In this example, 41 corresponds with C41. Character 3 represents the year class. J corresponds with 2019. Character 4 was the month. 8, 9, and 0 represent August, September, November, respectively. Characters 5 and 6 represent the day. 10 is obviously the 10th day of the month. And this resulted in about 38,000 spatial locations being encoded into the database. I had to first come up with a decoding key because everybody who's been involved in the study just kind of remembers this. So they look at it and they go, oh yeah, this is what I need. And I couldn't do that. So developing a decoding key for the first 6 characters was really important. They recorded data anomalies. This is not an entire list of data anomalies, just the ones that were relevant to me. They recorded hibernacula. They recorded infections, whether the turtle died, if it was unlocatable, whether it was relocated, whether it was removed from the study for any given number. The turtle ID year month were unchanged to fit into the waypoint spreadsheet. That way you could still track what happened to which turtle. And this is a sample set. Like I said, there was about 17 different data anomalies that I had to be able to account for. And now that we get into the project, this project has 3 phases. The first phase is to decode the database and prepare it for data extraction. Phase 2, perform a vegetation and habitat analysis of the study site. And phase 3, to evaluate the behavioral fidelity of eastern box turtle home range and hibernaculum site selection. Step 1, decoding the database. I developed a framework in GEOG 485 This is a picture of the Python script. It starts out by flags coordinates outside of my error margin. I should clarify, this script does not change the database in its current form, as when I talked to the contributors to the Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust, they wanted to continue to maintain data the same way. So in 485, it developed a framework to read from the database so that we could accept new updates. It was written in Python as a custom tool for ArcGIS Pro. We were able to identify geospatial errors outside of project bounds, help identify individuals with the active required study length. In this case, they were only interested in turtles with a study history of over 15 years. So we had to be able to query out any individuals with less. The script identifies and extracts anomalies that we select for, in this case, hibernaculum sites. The selected values were then converted to text so that we didn't have to read a bunch of very difficult recordings. And the study is ongoing, so we wanted to be able to easily accept any new year class. So all we have to do is change the reference to a new CSV file, which this reads. This is step one. Step two is a vegetation analysis. In 481, I used LiDAR to go over the site and to categorize the different habitats. I was able to get high vegetation, field habitats, low-lying vegetation, riparian areas delineated. Some further analysis there has helped turn it into a vegetation analysis. Cursory habitat delineations have been identified. What still needs to be done are edge habitats. Edge habitats have been noted as a unique characteristic associated with Eastern box turtles because they're travel corridors for them to feel protected. So there's still a little bit of work here that needs to be done. For behavioral fidelity, you need to identify preferences between high and low site fidelity, develop home range extents, develop hibernacula extents, and we'll compare and report. We're using Global Morians 1 autocorrelation to evaluate the overall data relationship. What we're looking for is to identify if individuals have a high site fidelity, then they should have a high hibernacula fidelity as well. The conservation efforts, what this is going to do is tell us that are the current conservation programs good enough, or do they need to change their strategy a little bit in order to key in on target areas for hibernaculum site selection. Typically, there's a lot of mortality associated with hibernaculums, whether they choose to hibernate in a low area or whether vegetation management kind of can go over them and kill them or really change their site selection preferences. So we'll use the data from the long-term high observation interval study to identify what variables are good enough. This will highlight the disparity in behaviors and fulfill a knowledge gap regarding hibernacula site selection in Eastern box turtles. This is my timeline. It's read from top to bottom, left to right. And some of the steps in green have already been completed at this point in time. We're still working through the vegetation analysis, which will then move right into the habitat analysis once we have completed the edge habitats. And then we can start phase 3 and develop the fidelity relationships. It's expected to be done by the end of fall 2022. And these are my expected results. I expect to have the database cleaned and ready for data extraction. That has been done. We are currently performing vegetation analysis for the study site. And the goal is to establish baseline hibernaculum site selection preferences and behaviors for translocated Eastern box turtles by evaluating the fidelity home range and hibernaculum site selection. I'm expecting to see high site fidelity behaviors be exhibited in hibernaculum site selection as well. Additionally, individuals with low site fidelity should exhibit low hibernaculum site fidelity, but we'll find out. And then these are the acknowledgements. The Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust has provided me with the use of their data set, as well as every year they send me their updates for the previous current year, and then the permits from the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commissions, which provide the functionality for this project to continue. These are my sources. Do I have any questions?
All right, Peter, thanks for that great presentation. Waiting for any questions to show up in the chat window. While we're waiting, I'll have a question for you. What do you anticipate being the most challenging part about your project?
Between the database and decoding, that took a very long time to do. A lot of their instructions and variables that they accounted for were captured in notebooks that were stored in the bottom of a closet. So to be able to go through and look at 29 years worth of notes to identify all of the different unique variables that occurred was one of the hardest parts so far. That has kind of been a continual updating process, as well as the habitat analysis. There were a lot of kind of moving pieces associated with that. It wasn't done all at one point. So just keeping up with everything, as well as developing my fidelity relationships at the end. That will be the last step to really come over. But at this point, a lot of the really difficult work has been done.
Yeah. Well, even though the tedium of dealing with those paper records, at least you have those records to deal with, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Looks like you have a question in the chat window.
It says, nice work, Peter. What are some of the public knowledge benefits that you think can be gained by completing your work? So this will be presented to the public. It'll be presented to the Fish and Boat Commission at one of their annual reptile publications by members of the Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust. I don't live in the state anymore, and if I can get there, I will certainly attend. I would love to talk about it. But this will go out and be public knowledge as well. I know Eastern Box Turtle Conservation Trust wants to publish this aspect and some additional aspects of hibernaculum site selection because it has not been documented in the past, and especially not with the high observation frequency data set. It's really a unique case where you have a long-term high quality data set. I have another question. Whoa. It says, excellent presentation. Are there any other animals that are managed / monitored in similar ways that can be studied in the way that you are proposing here for box turtles? Not typically. Yes, there are other species of box turtles. So there are 4 box turtle species in Terrapin, Carolina, and there are 6 subspecies within Terrapin, Carolina. So Eastern box turtle is Terrapin, Carolina, Carolina. And there are some additional turtles that don't have the same extent, that also exhibit a lot of the same behavioral preferences. So you can use those as kind of a guide and say, hey, yeah, this is it. But they come from different regions, whether they be in Mexico or whether they're out west and they live at different elevations, or whether they're from coastal regions. There's a pretty wide disparity of behaviors. What should be done if one finds a box turtle crossing the road? This is a pretty common question. I hear this pretty much everywhere. If you find a box turtle crossing the road and you can stop, feel free to stop and just help move them to the side of the road in which they were traveling. You don't want to turn them around because they do have homing behaviors that have been pretty well documented, and the homing behaviors will allow for, they'll still turn around and still try to get back across the road. So you want to help them in the direction that they are going. Just to help move their process along. They're not real fast unless you're trying to find them. You lose them in the weeds. They seem pretty fast then. All right, and that's the last of the questions.
All right, Peter, if you could put your contact info in the chat in case someone wants to follow up, that'd be great.
Sure.
Thanks to everyone who participated this evening. Best of luck to all the capstone students as they venture on with their capstone projects. We have another presentation for 596A tomorrow starting at 1 o'clock at the same Zoom address. So be sure to tune in for that. Otherwise, again, congratulations on getting through this step. Best of luck to all of you, and we will see you tomorrow, hopefully.